you've already been downstairs, you see we've got our own portable tabernacle down there. When she was making it, that's all she could think of. Felt like she was making the tabernacle there. But that's how they do it, you know, get these big pieces of cloth and sew them together, and it doesn't look the best, but their tabernacle served a purpose, and I trust that ours will. For those of you that fit into that category of needing a tabernacle like that, then please use it down there. Everyone else, stay out of it. Keep your children out of it, and all males, stay out of it. That's for the women there, so they can feel safe in there. Whatever word, I don't know what a better word is to use. Hallelujah. But anyway, you'll be able to hear the word while everything else is taking place. Well, we're back on Way Yikra tonight. We've covered Bereshith and Wael Shemot. We've got Wayed Haber and Ella Hadavarim to go, and then we'll, for the most part, be through with your Hebrew names of the book. Because then when it gets to Samuel, we'll just call him Samuel, and Joshua, Joshua. Well, you still got Wayed Haber and Ella Hadavarim to go, and then you'll have your Pentateuchal names, your Hebrew Pentateuchal names for these 5 books. Let's see, I'm on 16. We're through with 16. We're on Vayikra, Leviticus, the book of holiness in the Old Testament, paralleled with the book of Hebrews, and specifically Hebrews 5 to 10 in the New Testament, which, if we get time, we're going to go over to once we finish Leviticus and just look at several things there in light of what we've covered thus far in Leviticus. We're, of course, going to finish the book this evening. Divided up into 2 divisions. The first 16 chapters deal with how to get into God's presence, that is by way of substitution, by way of atonement of animals, their shed blood on the Israelites' behalf. And for we Christians on this side of the cross, no different, except that now it's the blood of God rather than the blood of bulls and goats. But we still enter that presence by blood shed on our behalf. Then chapters 17 through 27, the end of the book, which is what we'll be looking at tonight, deals with the subject of how to remain in that presence once substitutionary atonement and blood and reconciliation has been made for one. Then he is to obey all of God's statutes and laws, and this will guarantee his continual abiding in presence with the Lord, which, by the way, is stated concisely in your memory text, Leviticus 20, 7 to 8. Sanctify yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am the Lord your God. It doesn't say that over there in the first half of the book. You got to get holy before you can stay holy. And ye shall keep my statutes and do them. I am the Lord which sanctify you. Leviticus 20, 7 to 8. That, along with, I think I gave you Leviticus 11:44 and several other passages where it says, be ye holy, for I am holy, which is what is quoted over in 1 Peter 1, which we looked at last time. Now, of course, we divide the book here because there's a change in emphasis and a change in subject matter. This also happens to be the place where the critics divide the book of Leviticus between chapters 16 and 17 specifically. And here we go back to the critics and what they've had to say about the Pentateuch. And they relegate all of the rest of Leviticus, all that we'll be studying here this evening, to the time of Ezekiel. You remember, under the JEDP theory, the priestly writings, they date around 500, which would go from Ezekiel down to the time of Ezra. And there's a good reason, at least according to their thinking, why they are putting this much of the book, the second half, chapter 17 through 27, to the time of Ezekiel. That reason being much of the language that Ezekiel uses in his 48-chapter book parallels some exact phrases that are found in Leviticus 17 to 27. Such as, if you'll turn over to Ezekiel chapter 20, which we know to be written around 590 B.C. Now, the reason that the Graf, Kuhn, and Wellhausen trio put a date of 500 on it is that's the end of the period. Ezekiel, of course, came before 500, and Ezra really came a little bit after that. But you put it there at 500, and you're at the end of the period when this man named Ezekiel lived. Ezekiel 20 is a long chapter, but we could go over to verse 10. Wherefore I caused them to go forth out of the land of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness. Now you can tell that he's speaking here of something that took place in the past tense, something that took place a long time ago. And of course what they tell us when we read Leviticus 17 to 27, the language there implies that it's taking place at that time. And of course what they tell us is that Ezekiel is trying to deceive us by making it appear that took place in Moses' time and that Moses was actually the one writing it. But that language is in the present tense, and all of this is in the past tense, looking back to whenever God brought them out of Egypt. Remember, we are between the 1st and the 14th day of the first month of the second year after they came out of the land of Egypt. Between the 1st and 14th day of the first month of the second year. That's the time context. Now, Deuteronomy is a book written in, spoken in very short period of time, just over a month. But Leviticus, remember, is taking place in less than 2 weeks. We have to be able to get all of Leviticus in other words, before we have the Passover over in Numbers 9, which takes place on the 14th day of the first month of the second year. So we have to have this taking place ahead of time. Back to verse 10. Wherefore I caused them to go forth out of the land of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness. And I gave them my statutes and showed them my judgments, which if a man do, he shall live in them. Now that's a very direct phrase that is used over there in our text that we'll be looking at this evening from Leviticus 17 to 27, where he says, which if a man do, he shall live in them, which is what Paul is quoting over in Galatians 3. Moreover, also I gave them my Sabbath. We'll be mentioning that tonight in Leviticus chapter 23. To be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord that sanctify them. There's that word sanctify that we see used time and time again in Leviticus. But the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They walked not in my statutes, and they despised my judgments, which if a man do, he shall even live in them. There's that phrase again. And my Sabbaths they greatly polluted, when I said I would pour out my fury upon them in the wilderness to consume them, and so forth. There's one particular portion of Ezekiel sounds very similar to some of these writings that we attribute to the man Moses in Leviticus 17 to 27. So the critics are taking the final portion of the book, relegating this to the time of Ezekiel. What does the book itself say? And we have to take it at face value for what it says. Of course, their contention is you can't take it at face value because even though it says Moses wrote Leviticus, or Moses is the one being used of God in recording and in hearing these laws given in Leviticus, Ezekiel is simply putting his name in there, even though God is really giving this to Ezekiel. Well, what saith the Scriptures themselves? Let's look at some of these chapter titles in Leviticus. Leviticus 11 and verse 1, just the first verse, these chapter titles, the very beginning of each one of these chapters. That's why the chapters are divided here at this particular place, because for the most part, in many, many chapters of Leviticus, the first verse of the chapter starts off by saying, now these are the things the Lord spake to Moses, or saying, these are the things that the Lord spake to Moses and Aaron. Just watch how frequently this appears in both halves of the book. Now, see, they want to divide it up, but if we can find something that's recurrent from the first half all the way through the second half, that being that God is saying all the time to Moses, and to Aaron these various laws, then how can the critics come up and say, well, Ezekiel wrote chapter 17 through 27. What about the first 16 chapters that also have some phrases that are very similar to the second half of the book? Now, this is something you have to watch out for the critics in them doing that. They'll do the same thing with the book of Isaiah when we get there, and we'll be studying the Isaianic unity of his prophecy, all 66 chapters. Because beginning with chapter 40 and verse 1 of Isaiah, where he starts off 39 chapters of nothing but scathing denunciation of the people, now all of a sudden, what does he say? Comfort ye, my people. And the rest of the book is on nothing but comfort. Must have mean two people wrote the book. The first fellow's mad at Israel. The second fellow's wanting to console and comfort Israel. And so he wrote chapters 40 to 66. See, that they find a division in the book that we happen to see ourselves. There is a division in the book there. It's because subject matter is changing, not because authorship is changing. It's because there's a change in the subject matter. But there is something that ties Leviticus together, and it's the first verse of most of its chapters. Leviticus 11:1. And the Lord spake unto Moses and to Aaron. Now we have to take this at face value. It didn't say he spoke this to Ezekiel. He spoke this to Moses and Aaron. You'll have to just turn quickly. Chapter 12 and verse 1. And the Lord spake unto Moses. Chapter 13. And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron. Chapter 14. And the Lord spake unto Moses. Chapter 15. And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron. Chapter 16, and the Lord spake unto Moses. Now we're to the second half. Chapter 17 doesn't change here. Doesn't say now the Lord spake to Ezekiel. And the Lord spake unto Moses. Chapter 18, and the Lord spake unto Moses. Chapter 19, and the Lord spake unto Moses. Chapter 20, and the Lord spake unto Moses. 21, the Lord spake unto Moses. 22, the Lord spake unto Moses. 23, the Lord spake unto Moses. 24, the Lord spake unto Moses. 25, the Lord spake unto Moses. It skips 26 and verse 1 of chapter 27, and the Lord spake unto Moses. Now, from what we just covered there, every chapter in the second half of the book, with the exception of chapter 26, which is the unique chapter on the blessings and the cursings we know given by Moses over in Deuteronomy 27, and then, of course, in Deuteronomy 28, it always says, and the Lord spake unto Moses. As a matter of fact, it says that in the end of the book just as much, if not more, than it does in the beginning of the book. And that's why we have a basic division at these particular points within this whole scene of Leviticus 1 to 27, the beginning of each one of these, what we call chapters, because it starts with a new verse, and the Lord spake unto Moses. Now remember from Leviticus 1 and verse 1, God is talking to him out of the tabernacle. The cloud has come down on the very end, in the very end of the book of Exodus in chapter 40, the last half a dozen verses in Exodus chapter 40. The cloud has come down with the angel of the covenant indwelling that cloud to such a degree that Moses is not even able to enter in to the tabernacle. That's why Leviticus 1:1 says, and he called, and the Lord called Moses, and spake unto him out of the tabernacle. God's in there, and his voice is coming out of the tabernacle telling Moses all of these things. Taking place within either all on the same day, or the first day, and then the 8th day, or whatever, but taking place within 14 days, God telling them all these things. Well, let's begin looking at each one of these chapters, our divisions here in this second part of the book. In chapter 17, which is a real short chapter, the shortest chapter, of course, is chapter 12 that deals with childbirth. Chapter 17 is another one that's very short, contains two very important laws in it. Verses 1 to 9 is the law of the place of offering. Verses 10 through 16 concerns the law of not eating blood. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto Aaron, and unto his sons, and unto all the children of Israel, and say unto them, This is the thing which the Lord hath commanded, saying, Now remember, we've just gone through chapter 16, which is the Day of Atonement. The greatest day as far as they are concerned with respect to their sins being covered over by the blood of the animals. Now they've been made holy. Now they're into God's presence, and now we're going to find out how to stay there. And he starts giving them all these laws to do and to obey. What man soever there be of the house of Israel that killeth an ox or lamb or goat in the camp, or that killeth it out of the camp, they were allowed to do both of these things, and bringeth it not unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation to offer an offering unto the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord, blood shall be imputed unto that man. He has shed blood. And that man shall be cut off from among his people. To the end, in other words, this is the purpose or the intent of that law, to the end that the children of Israel may bring their sacrifices which they offer in the open field, even that they may bring them unto the Lord, unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, unto the priest, and offer them for peace offerings unto the Lord. And the priest shall sprinkle the blood upon the altar of the Lord at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and burn the fat for a sweet savor unto the Lord. And they shall no more offer their sacrifices unto demons, after whom they have gone a-whoring. This shall be a statute, and that's what we see throughout Leviticus, statutes, forever unto them throughout their generations. Now this law was given, as he tells us in verse 5, to the intent that it would dissuade and lead them away from idolatry. Because in past times, God's people were allowed just to build an altar wherever they wanted to and offer whatever type of sacrifice they wanted to offer upon it to the Lord. And because Israel does not obey this, later on in Samuel and Kings and Chronicles is where you find the mentioning of the groves and the high hills no longer taking their sacrifices to the one central sanctuary, and that is at the tabernacle to offer to the Lord, but that all from, we're told in Samuel and Kings, under every green tree. And this is what God wants to dissuade them from. Because from verse 7, what has apparently happened, and we're not given a lot of detail about this, is that they have gone aside with regard to idolatry to a much greater degree than just Exodus 32 would tell us, whenever they, remember, made the golden calf there in Exodus 32. They've evidently been doing some other type of sacrificing to demons, because he said, and they shall no more offer their sacrifices, which means they must have been doing it previous to this time, unto demons, after whom they have gone a-whoring. Deuteronomy 12, verses 13 and 14. Take heed to thyself that thou offer not thy burnt offering in every place that thou seest, but in the place which the Lord shall choose in one of thy tribes, there thou shalt offer thy burnt offerings, and there thou shalt do all that I commanded thee. Deuteronomy 12, 13 and 14. Now remember, Deuteronomy 12 is after 40 years of wandering. Leviticus 17 is before the 40 years of wandering. So we see here again God's foreknowledge of the events going to take place, because he is telling them in Leviticus 17 to make sure that you bring your offering unto the tabernacle here. Now he says something different when we get to Deuteronomy 12. He said, I want you to bring it. He's talking about when they get into the promised land, to whatever place I choose there out among a particular tribe. And of course we know that they stayed other places before they ended up in Jerusalem, but Jerusalem, the city that King David took, was the ultimate place that God was going to choose out of the tribe of Judah for them to offer their sacrifices there at this place. Otherwise, you end up kind of like people floating around from one church to another. They'd go from one altar to another, just build it anywhere. There are no priests or no ministers there to supervise what they're doing, to make sure what they're doing is scriptural. They could just pretty much go out anywhere they wanted to on their own and sacrifice somewhere. Now, if you look all the way back over in Genesis chapter 8, where we see our first altar being built here, they had no laws like this, of course, in Genesis, because these are the Mosaic laws of legislation. In Genesis 8, In verse 20, we know this is not even in the promised land here. This is up in northeastern modern-day Turkey. And Noah's building an altar there. And Noah, Genesis 8:20, building an altar unto the Lord. The patriarch Abraham in Genesis 12, verses 6 to 8, is building several altars here. Everywhere he moves around, as soon as he stops, and here he goes building another altar. Now, under the Mosaic law, this is strictly forbidden. And Abram passed through the land unto the place of Sychem, unto the plain or the oaks of Moreh. And the Canaanite was then in the land. The Lord appeared unto Abram and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land, and there builded he an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. Verse 8, And he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and high on the east, and there he builded an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. So he's building an altar in verse 7 in one place, an altar in verse 8 in an entirely different place. Also in chapter 22 and verse 9. Where is the first altar that Moses built? Anyone remember? Where's the first one Moses built? No, not where he was called. How about Exodus 17, verse 15? What's Exodus 17 about? Doing good on your test. Don't forget it now just because you turn your little quizzes in. I'm proud of you for those who had one turned in 40 pages just to answer that quiz. Some of you 15, 20 pages. 40 pages, a minor book, just to answer a few questions from the Old Testament. But I was blessed reading it, though. I get to review all of what I'm supposed to know. When everyone turns in a 40-page book, then you've got several thousand pages to read. Exodus 17 is about the battle with Amalek. This is the first place Joshua appears. Verse 15, this is after they win the victory. Moses built an altar and called the name of it Yahweh Nisi. For he said, Because the Lord has sworn that the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. First place the Lord is mentioning an altar to Moses is in chapter 20, verses 24 and 25. We're not going to turn there, but that's where it's found. And this little portable tabernacle, they're just going to take with them everywhere. That's why it was built the way it was, because it was meant to be a portable construction. That they could, because see, you've got the three different divisions of the Levites, that we'll cover later on in Numbers, and these particular men had to carry the tabernacle wherever they're going. That's why we end up with that long chapter on the offerings of the princes over in Numbers, and some of the things they offer are these big wagons, because you get carrying all that gold around with you. You know how heavy gold is. One bar of gold is extremely heavy. When you've got instruments, whole instruments made out of solid gold, there's no way you can carry something like that. And they end up having wagons that they're going to transport this thing in. Some particular instruments are carried on the priest's shoulders that we'll be showing you in the three divisions of the Levitical family. But that's why it's constructed in this way, so they could set it up whenever the cloud came down. That was time to set the tabernacle up, and they would have the altar that they had been carrying with them, the altar of burnt offering, the first thing on the eastern side of the court where you'd first come into the door. There's where you'd find the altar of burnt offering, and of course this is where they'd do their offering. Now in the second half of Leviticus 17, another important law, that is the law in verses 10 through 16 of not eating any blood. The reason being that God was going to use the blood to symbolize the life of the individual and eventually the life of Christ that would be given. Consequently, he's going to keep the blood symbolically holy before the people. They could not eat the blood. To this day, and I'm not saying we're under Leviticus 17 law, but I refuse to eat meat That's bloody. Some people like raw meat. I just don't do that. That, to the Old Testament saint, was something holy and precious that you did not eat of. And like I said, I'm not saying we're under Leviticus 17, but sometimes some of us just go the extra length to make sure. Leviticus 17 and verse 10, I don't like meat when you've got to run after it after you put it on your plate anyway. I never have liked to carry a gun to the table. Some of them are that way. They'd kick, if you didn't stab them with a fork in a hurry. I want to make sure that it's dead and cooked before I'm going to eat the thing. Whatsoever man there be of the house of Israel, or of the strangers that sojourn among them, that eateth any manner of blood, I will even set my face against that soul that eateth blood, and will cut him off from among his people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood. You can take the brain out, and you can take the heart out, and the lungs and the kidneys, but you can't take the blood out of the body and keep it alive. For I have given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls. For it is the blood, not the meat, it's the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul. Therefore I said unto the children of Israel, no soul of you shall eat blood, neither shall any stranger that sojourneth among you eat blood. And whatsoever man there be of the children of Israel, or of the strangers that sojourn among them, which hunteth and catcheth any beast or fowl that may be eaten, he shall even pour out the blood thereof, and look at this, cover it with dust. Couldn't even leave the blood exposed on the ground. He's talking about if he went hunting for an animal, a clean one that was edible, that he was not intending to sacrifice, and he slew the animal. Let's say he had to, a bird, he would wring the head or the neck off, then that blood he couldn't leave exposed on the ground. Had to cover it up with dust because it was holy in the sight of the Lord. And of course, this goes all the way back to the beginning. Remember with Cain and Abel, what was it that cried unto God concerning Abel's death? Thy brother's blood crieth to me. That's Genesis chapter 4. Very important from Genesis to Revelation is the blood. Most people don't realize that little note in Leviticus 17, verse 13. And they go and watch these horror movies that capitalize on how much blood can be spilt. That's an abomination to God. The blood to him in the Old Testament was something holy. You see, even Christians major in areas like that. If they would know more about their Bible, they'd see that, as we often say, the Bible leaves no stone unturned. It covers everything that needs to be covered. You just stay with it long enough, you'll see it. For it is the life of all flesh. The blood of it is for the life thereof. Therefore I said unto the children of Israel, ye shall eat the blood of no manner of flesh. For the life of all flesh is the blood thereof. Whosoever eateth it shall be cut off. And every soul that eateth that which died of itself, or that which was torn with beast, whether it be one of your own country or a stranger, he shall both wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the even, then shall he be clean. But if he wash them not, nor bathe his flesh, then he shall bear his iniquity. That's why we should have no problem at all believing that, as we've taught here before, it was the blood of Jesus that atoned for our sins and not his stay in hell. That disagrees with everything all 39 books of the Old Testament have had to say. It's always the blood. The life's not in hell, the life's in the blood. Now in chapters 18 to 20, some of these we group together because they go together. Chapters 18 to 20 deal just with various laws. But the first 5 verses of chapter 18 set the scene for these 3 chapters, 18, 19, and 20. In other words, these 5 verses of Leviticus 18, the first 5 verses, are introductory to what he's going to say in chapter 18, 19, and 20, because chapter 21 picks up a new subject. So we'll read these first 5 verses. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, I am the Lord your God. After the doings of the land of Egypt, wherein ye dwelt. Now remember, this is one of the verses we use to prove that at least this portion of the Pentateuch had to have been written somewhere in the desert, because it looks to Egypt in the past tense, It looks to the promised land in the future tense. The only place in between Egypt and the promised land is for the time period and the place of the wandering in the wilderness, which proves it couldn't have been written by Ezekiel. After the doings of the land of Egypt, he's looking back. Wherein ye dwelt, ye shall not do. Now, does this sound like it's written by someone that's actually in the promised land? And after the doings of the land of Canaan, whither I bring you, shall ye not do, neither shall ye walk in their ordinances. Had to be somewhere in between there, and that was in the wilderness. Ye shall do my judgments and keep mine ordinances to walk therein. I am the Lord your God. Ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which, if a man do, he shall live in them. I am the Lord.
For the continuation of this message, please
ordinances to walk therein. I am the Lord your God. Ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which, if a man do, he shall live in them. I am the Lord. There we got the phrase that's repeated twice that we read in Ezekiel 20, but chapter 5 comes, verse 5 comes after verse 3. That puts it somewhere in between their exodus and their entrance into the land of Canaan. The rest of chapter 18 deals with sexual purity. One interesting verse is 18, Leviticus 18:18. Neither shalt thou take a wife to her sister to vex her, to uncover her nakedness beside the other in her lifetime. A little bit difficult, but what do you think that's saying? Look over in your margin. Maybe that'll help a little more. The margin gives you somewhat better. What do you think that verse means? No, not a sister-in-law. Or depends on, well, that would all depend on what, you can have a different type of sister-in-law there. Can't marry two sisters. That's what you mean. Okay, well, it would apply there. You can't marry two sisters. Now remember, Jacob had been allowed to do this with Rachel and Leah. And this is something instituted in the Mosaic law that you could not do. Could not marry two sisters. That's getting too close in the same family, which they had been, of course, allowed to do earlier. Then in chapter 19 and chapter 20, many religious and civil laws. Can't really sum them up any better way than that because they're so diverse. So 19 and 20 deal with various religious and civil laws. Now there is a passage in Leviticus 18. Let's see where that begins. Leviticus 18, beginning with verse 24. That's repeated again over in chapter 20, beginning with verse 22. That's one of the better texts in the Old Testament to show why God could justly and righteously send Joshua in and murder helpless men, women, and children. There's a reason why he could do that. And of course, people don't like that. They've got a problem with war in the Old Testament. See, war is not allowed in the New Testament. Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 and verse 42. Not allowed then. Not only allowed back then, but commanded of God back then. What does it say here? These are two good texts to show why God could do this. Defile not ye yourselves in any of these things, for in all these the nations are defiled, which I cast out before you. And the land is defiled, therefore I do visit the iniquity thereof upon it, and the land itself vomiteth out her inhabitants. Such a wicked and grotesque people that figuratively he could say even the land is vomiting up the inhabitants that live on it. They were that perverse and wicked. Ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations, neither any of your own nation, nor any stranger that sojourneth among you. Couldn't even allow church visitors to transgress God's law. For all these abominations have the men of the land done, which were before you, and the land is defiled, that the land spew not you out also when ye defile it, as it spewed out the nations that were before you. Chapter 20 and verse 22. Ye shall therefore keep all my statutes and all my judgments and do them, that the land whither I bring you to dwell therein spew you not out. Kind of sounds like what Jesus says over in, where? Revelation 3. You're not hot or cold, but I'll spew you out. Ye shall not walk in the manners of the nations which I cast out before you, for they committed all these things, therefore I abhorred them. But I have said unto you, ye shall inherit their land, and I will give it unto you to possess it, a land that floweth with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, which have separated you from other people, a chosen, distinct, separate people that God had called unto himself. Another division is chapters 21 and 22, which concern the holiness of the priests. We can see in the first verse of both of these chapters, or the first two verses of both of these chapters, God is speaking specifically to the priests here, not to everyone. Various laws, religious and civil laws, that were given to the priests. Now, these weren't for the Levites. These were just for the priests here, that were to keep them bound in and unto God in a holy and righteous way. One particular law that's interesting, that we see at least part of over in the New Testament, is in verses 13 and 14 of Leviticus 21. A priest, that type of minister, could only marry a virgin. There were three particular types of women in verse 14 he was forbidden to marry. First of all, a widow. Couldn't even marry a widow. Secondly, a divorced woman. Thirdly, he couldn't marry a harlot or a whore. A widow, a divorced person, or a harlot. Now, if you'll look over in 1 Timothy chapter 3, part of this is carried over into the New Testament. The one thing that is definitely not carried over, as we see in 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 11, concerns virgins, because God speaks of them there, both, of course it includes both male and female, and speaking of those who had lost their virginity, he said, but such were some of you. But ye were sanctified, but ye were justified in the name of our Lord Jesus. But when it comes to these two other categories, then we've got some more scripture that deals with them. Well, we could start with verse 1. This is the true saying, if a man desire the office of a bishop, he desireth a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, and he must be the husband of one wife. Now, that speaks at least partly in two of these areas. Obviously, he can't be divorced. And another thing that we can determine from the same verse, when it says he, the husband of one wife, what if his wife has died? Can he remarry again and then be a minister? It says the husband of one wife here. Now, he can remarry if his wife has died. But the scripture even has something to say about remarriage over in the end of 1 Corinthians 7, if you'll look there. What does Paul say about remarriage if your spouse has died? 1 Corinthians 7:39, the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. But if her husband be dead, or you could say if his wife be dead, then he or she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. But he's happier if he so abide after my judgment, and I think also that I have the Spirit of God. In other words, he said, I think they ought to just stay like they are. They've had one wife. That's enough for them to have. So that got into Scripture. Now, Paul does say that's my judgment, but he also says, I think I've got the Spirit of God in this area too. All we're going to say about that. Back to Leviticus. Husband of one wife, something that's too hard, that was required back in the Old Testament. That was required by God's priests, his ministers, in Leviticus 21, verses 13 and 14. Obviously, if you are a widow or if you are a divorced individual, practically 100% of the time, that makes you not a virgin, which is what he covers in Leviticus 21 and verse 13, and he shall take a wife in her virginity. And he didn't have to go on and explain you can't have someone divorced, because if you're divorced, that means you're not a virgin anymore. One in a trillion chance that you're probably not a virgin anymore. Various other laws given here in 21 and 22. Chapter 23 is a chapter in itself dealing with the sacred seasons. And it's the best chapter because it deals with most of them. There are 8 sacred seasons found here in Leviticus 23. We'll mention these. And of course there were 10 in Old Testament Judaism in all by the time we come up to Christ. And I'll see if you can tell me what those other 2 were that we add on to these 8 by the time we get through with chapter 23. The first one's found in verses 1 to 3. Now these are called in your King James holy convocations. Same thing. It means sacred seasons unto the Lord. Holy convocations or sacred seasons. The first one is the Sabbath. Now that's something that happened every single week, but that was considered a sacred holy season, a holy convocation. Verses 1 to 3, the Sabbath. Verses 4 and 5, the Passover. Verses 6 through 8, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, remember these 2, your Passover and your Feast of Unleavened Bread, go together. So sometimes you'll see the Passover mentioned, and there's no mentioning given of unleavened bread. But unleavened bread follows on the 15th day of the month, right after the Passover on the 14th day of the month, and it lasts for another 7 days. And what you end up having here, we don't want to get into these feasts, but just to help you understand, sometimes it appears that you've got 2 Sabbath days that happen right beside each other, and that's exactly what you have. You, on many of these occasions, have 2 Sabbath days where they'll have a Sabbath like their Saturday, which is their normal weekly Sabbath. Then they'll have a particular Sabbath because it falls on some particular feast day. Therefore, they'll go right ahead and celebrate Sunday as a Sabbath also. Now, there was a difference in that Sabbath in that there were certain things they were allowed to do on a feast Sabbath that they weren't allowed to do on a weekly Sabbath, such as preparing meat. They were not allowed to do this on their regular day, on their regular Sabbath. But on some of their feast Sabbaths, there were laxations in this that were allowed by the Lord. But what I was saying was that sometimes you'll have either or of these. The Passover, not mentioning unleavened bread, or it'll talk about them celebrating the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which had to be preceded by the Feast of the Passover. In other words, sometimes you can consider these as one feast, the Feast of Unleavened Bread or the Feast of the Passover, because they always come together. They do happen to be broken up here, though, as you can see in verses 5 and 6. Fourthly, a 4th sacred season, verses 9 to 14, and that's the Feast of First Fruits. Then verses 15 to 22, the Feast of Harvests. What are some other names for this feast? The Feast of Harvest. Because you'll see them used by different names, and you'll think he's talking about a different feast, unless you know that there are 3 particular names that are all synonymous here. The Feast of Harvest, Pentecost, and the Feast of Weeks. These are all the same thing. No, ingathering is another feast. But if you can get these together here, then when you see them later on appear under a different title, you'll realize it's speaking of the same feast. The Feast of Harvest, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Pentecost. Verses 23 through 25, the Feast of Trumpets. What's that known as today? You'll see that on your calendar. This brother works in don't you work in a Jewish synagogue or something? You know what this particular feast is called, the Feast of Trumpets? What are those words you see on your calendar? See, they print the calendars up, thank God, even so the Jews can understand them. They put their holidays on there. Don't put the Muslims' holidays, but most of the time you'll see the Jewish holidays on there. Rosh Hashanah. Remember seeing that word? Or two words together? Rosh Hashanah. That's the same as the Feast of Trumpets, which signifies the civil New Year. That's the same as our January 1st, in other words. It's the New Year. The Feast of Trumpets signifies the civil New Year. Now remember, they've got two different calendars in Israel, a religious calendar and a civil calendar. Now, what's the first month of the religious calendar? Abib. What's it changed to later on, after the exile? Nisan. That's the first month, Abib. We find that all the way back in Exodus 13 and 14, or 12, 13, and 14. That's the first month of the religious calendar. Now, that corresponds to which month on the civil calendar? Seventh one. Just about halfway through there, in other words, one more than half. The first month of the religious calendar is going to correspond over here to their seventh month. In other words, you've got them just backwards here. You've got 12 months and you've got 12 months, but they're just counting from a different time. And this month is known as Tishri, Tishri. Tishri. So this is not the beginning of the religious year. This is the beginning of their civil year. And it's signified by the blowing of trumpets, which they don't even have in Leviticus 23. You realize that? They don't even have any trumpets to blow yet. These don't come. These are the very last thing. I'll just give you this before we get to Numbers. The trumpets are the very last things given to the people before they begin to leave Mount Sinai. That's over in Numbers 10. That's the last thing that happens before they leave Mount Sinai. God says, make 2 silver trumpets. The trumpets were for battle and for war, and they were for calling out the beginning of the new year. And this was a particular feast that they had, blowing the trumpets. Okay, where does that put us? On the 7th one, verses 26 through 32, is the Day of Atonement. What's that called? For us English people, how's that pronounced? Yom Kippur. How do the Hebrews say it? Someone said it. Yom Kippur. They put the accent different than we do. Yom Kippur. We call it Yom Kippur. Now, what do you know about that from what we studied in some other classes? What do you know about that Hebrew there? Yom Kippur. Yom. We just studied it last week. Day. It means day in Hebrew. Remember the Yom. Yamim is plural, Yom is singular. So you know right away it's going to be the day of something. What's Kippur mean? You might not know what that means. Covering. It's the covering. We use the English word atonement. There's no such word in the Hebrew as atonement. It's the word covering. This is the great day of covering. What do you think that means? See, the Hebrew is so symbolical in everything it says and does. It's the day that your sins are covered over by the blood. I mean, who knows what atonement means? You've got to have a dictionary definition to find out what a 5-gallon word like an atonement means. But if you say that's the day of covering, the Hebrew knows, my sins are covered over on this day. So that's why they call it Yom Kippur. Then finally, verses 33 through 44. 33 through 44 is the Feast of Tabernacles, also known as the Feast of Ingathering and the Feast of Booths. You ever been in a Jewish neighborhood and seen the little booths outside? Sometimes they're up on top of their houses. Ever seen those before? That's the Feast of Tabernacles. Because God says here, we can't read these passages, but he's giving them this because he said whenever you came out, you didn't have walled cities and fenced places to dwell in, but you dwelt in little booths wherever you went. And this was to remind them of their coming out of Egypt and dwelling in booths. So it's the Feast of Tabernacles or booths, also ingathering because of the particular time of year at which this was. Chapter 24, verses 1 to 9 deal with two particular things inside the tabernacle. Really, this chapter is divided up. Verses 1 to 9 deal with two particular things in the tabernacle. The first one being the oil for the lampstand. That's verses 1 to 4. Verses 5 to 9, the shewbread for the table of shewbread. They had to keep the oil supplied and keep fresh shewbread each Sabbath day. 12 loaves, weighed several pounds each. I mean, these were big loaves of bread. Again, not your little morsel or cracker or crumb. These were huge loaves of bread they put out that, of course, the priest had to eat. 7 days old. They had to eat it when it was stale. Couldn't eat it when it was hot. That was dedicated to the Lord. By the end of the week, it was pretty old sitting out in that hot climate, and the priest had to eat it after that. Then in verses 10 through 23, we have our second narrative scene in the book, and these are really the only two narrative scenes we have in Leviticus. It's all laws and legislation. Verses 10 through 23, we have our second narrative scene. Now, obviously, the question I'm fixing to ask you is, what was the first narrative scene? Nadab and Abihu. Good. That's back in chapter 10. The death of Nadab and Abihu. That's the first place where we actually see some real action taking place in Leviticus. It's not a book of action at all. Numbers is a book of action. You've got people being swallowed by earthquakes there. But Leviticus is a book of laws. This particular narrative scene concerns a man blaspheming the Lord and being stoned to death on account of it. Happens to be one of those mixed multitudes that came up, the son of an Israelitish woman and an Egyptian father. Got angry one day and blasphemed the name of the Lord, used his name in vain, in other words. One of the commandments in chapter 20 of Exodus they were forbidden to do, and as a result he was stoned to death. Chapter 25, now we looked in 23 at the sacred seasons. Chapter 25 is the sacred years. The first 7 verses, the sabbatical year. Ever heard of professors taking a sabbatical leave? Professors from seminary take a sabbatical leave. 1 to 7, sabbatical year, then almost all the chapter, verses 8 through 55, the year of Jubilee. Very important year, which is mentioned cryptically in Isaiah 61, 1 to 3, and Luke 4, 18 and 19. Chapter 26 is a chapter on the blessings and the curses, very similar to what we'll see later in Deuteronomy. The blessings and the curses, the blessings found in verses 1 to 13, always just a few verses on the blessings. We know what's good for us. We wouldn't have God to tell us what's blessed, what blessings are. We could tell him what we thought were blessings. And he always gives the most amount of material to the curses. Verses 14 through 46, the curses. All summed up in the last verse of this chapter. All of Leviticus thus far summed up in Leviticus 26:46. These are the statutes and judgments and laws which the Lord made between him, the Lord, and the children of Israel in Mount Sinai by the hand of Moses. And finally, chapter 27 is more or less like a little addition onto the end of the book, and it concerns vows and tithes. Complicated material that we're not going to even mention anything about, but it concerns one's vows and his tithes. Do we have enough time to, well, I didn't need that anymore anyway, to go over to Hebrews. We'll just look at as much as we can here before we need to close up. Thank you. Hebrews 5 and verse 1. Now you'll see how a lot of this is pointing back here to Leviticus. For every high priest taken from among men is ordained for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. Remember in the 5 offerings in the first 7 chapters, some of those were sacrifices for sins, some of those were free will offerings or gifts to the Lord given in thanksgiving and appreciation for what he had done. So here's what he's talking about, gifts and sacrifices. Who can have compassion on the ignorant and on them that are out of the way, for that he himself also is compassed with weakness? For by reason hereof he ought, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer for sin. And no man taketh this honor unto himself, but he that is called of God, as was Aaron. So also Christ glorified not himself to be made an high priest, but he that said unto him in Psalm 110, Thou art my son, today have I begotten thee. Well, that's over in Psalm 2. It's the next verse in Psalm 110. As he saith also in another place, Thou art a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. And so we see dealing with high priest there. Chapter 7 is just a fascinating chapter dealing with this subject of Melchizedek, that we can get all types of information from, dealing with everything from who Melchizedek was to the subject of abortion. Hebrews 7 is one of the better chapters, believe it or not, for dealing with the subject of abortion, that you'll probably never see in 100 years if you read the chapter every day for 100 years, but that we'll be bringing out one of these days or one of these years if we stay around 100 of them. Going on through the rest of the chapter, again, he's dealing with the subject of priests and especially of high priests. Chapter 8, dealing with priests again. Chapter 9, dealing with the tabernacle and some of the symbolism that was given in the tabernacle. He goes from verse 2, There was a tabernacle made, the first wherein was the lampstand, the table, the shewbread, which is called the sanctuary, or really the holy place. And after the second veil, the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all, which had the golden censer, the ark of the covenant, overlaid round about with gold, wherein was the golden pot that had manna. We'll see this over in Numbers 17, I believe. Aaron's rod, the next one. And Aaron's rod that budded, and the tables of the covenant, and over it the cherubim of glory, shadowing the mercy seat, of which we cannot now speak particularly. In other words, he knew some more here that he just couldn't say about these cherubim, and a lot about the cherubim and them being over the ark. He said, I can't speak particularly about that. Now when these things were thus ordained, the priest went always into the first tabernacle, accomplishing the service of God. But into the second went the high priest alone, once every year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the heirs of the people. Down in verse 22, now that you've seen a little thing or two about the offerings in the first 7 chapters of Leviticus, Hebrews 9:22 makes more sense when it says, And almost all things are by the law purged with blood. Without shedding of blood is no remission. He said almost all things. Because remember, in some cases, if the person was really poor and had no finances whatsoever, that instead of giving a bullock or a large offering, they could give a turtle dove or a young pigeon. And if even that was beyond their financial monetary wherewithal, then they could give some type of cereal or meal or grain offering, of course it had no blood in it. And God would even accept that on their behalf as long as they were, of course, poor in a financial sense. This is what verse 22 is speaking of. And then in chapter 10, the first half of chapter 10 deals with the sacrifice of bulls and goats by saying their blood was insufficient for the final eradication of the Old Testament saints' sins, and for that they needed the antitype, Christ, to wash away their sins. Not only to cover their sins, which was one thing, but to wash away their sins. So that finishes up Leviticus, and then we'll start on Numbers next time.
For a complete list of Brother Ross's tapes and books, please write Faith Teaching Ministries, Post Office Box 227, Waconia, Minnesota, zip code 55387. Forms for the automatic tape mailing list are also available